Hello, and welcome to Good News Rhode Island, the show about Rhode Island and the people and places and events that make Rhode Island a great place to live, that build our communities. It seems today and over the last year, we've learned that reconciliation is about the most important thing that we can do in our communities. We can look at each other, see our diversities, and celebrate them. And a center is being formed in Providence that's going to do just that and probably more. The old Cathedral of St. John, the Episcopal Cathedral on North Main Street in Providence, is being transformed even as we speak. And we have two people here who are going to head the Center for Reconciliation in Rhode Island. James DeWolf Perry is here as the executive director, and Alon Cook is here as the curator and museum person who does everything, I bet. Program manager, I'm sorry. But I welcome you both here, and I think this is good news on various levels because that building has been a little derelict, and now moving back into a new life will be important, but also because the history of Rhode Island is so related to the issues of reconciliation and slave trade and white wealth, and et cetera. So we need to talk about all those things today. So, James, how did you get involved in this project? The movie that you helped to make, the family that you're part of. What's your history with this?
So I've been working in this field for about 15 years now, and the last 5 years I've been executive director of another organization, the Tracing Center up in Boston. But I actually got into this work in a very unusual way. My full name, James DeWolf Perry, has been in my family for generations. It goes back to James DeWolf, who was my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather. And as I suspect many of your viewers will know, James DeWolf was a Rhode Islander and a slave trader. And this was something I had no idea about growing up. Growing up, I understood New England to have been a place that had a little bit of slavery, but I thought it was mild and early, and we got away from it pretty quickly, none of which turns out to have been true. And I discovered as an adult what our family connection was, thanks to a distant relative named Katrina Brown, who had the idea to make a film about our family's history. And as we started to work on the film, we discovered that James DeWolf, in fact, had not only been a slave trader, but he'd been the leading slave trader in the history of the United States. James DeWolf and his extended family brought more than 12,000 enslaved Africans across the Middle Passage. And that adds up to easily 500,000 people alive today who were brought over on DeWolf ships. And as we set about making what became Traces of the Trade, a PBS documentary, we came to understand that while our family story is a dramatic one and an unusual one in a sense, it's also very representative of the history of Rhode Island and of New England in slavery. The ways in which the slave trade and slave owning and the economics connected to slavery had been an essential part of what we had been and of how our institutions had functioned and how we got the successes that we did as a society. And so we made this film and we started showing this. We gradually came to understand that there was a national conversation to be had about race in this country that was being held back in part because most people buy into myths that slavery was a Southern phenomenon, that slavery had no lasting consequences for the country, that the North was either innocent in slavery and race or had been on the right side of history, and that was the extent of our involvement. And so starting to unpack some of this history, learning what some of the myths are historically and myths that we have about race today can really be a way to spur conversations about race and move towards reconciliation. And so this is how I became involved in this, understanding that my family history really in some ways is symbolic of the regional history and the national history.
And were you a filmmaker or were you a historian? Or what is your training?
I actually was a PhD student in political science when we made the film.
Okay, so it fits a little bit.
It fit a little bit, and I actually became the principal historical consultant to the project. And it was Katrina Brown, that distant relative, who had never made a film before but found herself having to become a filmmaker for the first time in order to make this. We actually aired nationwide on PBS a few years ago when the film came out, and we were nominated for an Emmy for the historical research into the DeWolf family and Rhode Island's history in the slave trade.
Well, congratulations. That's learning fast on your feet. Alon, you're here now since July.
Yes.
In this new business, essentially. Are there any other reconciliation centers in the United States?
There are a few, but they do something slightly different than what we do.
So you came here as a historic student, or what kind of a student? A history?
I was a grad student at Brown University in the Public Humanities program.
Mm-hmm. And you're part in this new being that's going to come to pass?
My part is as the program manager and the curator for the museum. So I moved to Rhode Island to take the Fellowship for the Study of Slavery and Justice at Brown University. So I had been studying the history of slavery in America, early African American history, and I had worked with them on Brown's Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice doing its very first exhibition. So I'd been getting a lot of exhibition and museum experience, and so this was kind of the perfect project
The next
for me.
step.
Definitely.
Definitely. So how related to Brown will the center be? I'm just trying to figure it all out.
So the Center for Reconciliation was initiated by the Episcopal Diocese of Rhode Island. They're our primary partner. We've got several other formal partnerships, including the Tracing Center, which I mentioned I had been running for several years, and Brown University's Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice. Their head is on our board of directors and has been involved in the project, and we've been co-sponsoring events, that sort of thing.
So as you work forward, because you're a curator, are you going to be collecting archival materials as well?
We may be loaning, maybe borrowing certain objects. People have been donating a few things to us, but that's not going to be our primary focus. It's really going to be focusing on the telling of this amazing history that this state has and its connections to the international slave trade.
When you went back to Africa and when you pulled together all of this material, what was the most important thing that you learned? You must have been really impressed. It must have made a huge impression on you.
Well, it did, and of course, we're looking at the terrible history of slavery and the slave trade in the film through the eyes of DeWolf descendants, for whom understanding that our ancestors had played such a key role was the overpowering feature. I went into this international journey across the Triangle Trade deeply aware that my ancestor and the man that I'm ultimately named for had played such a tremendous role and had impacted so many lives. But over the course of that, I came to realize the story was actually much bigger than that. For me, the turning point came in the courtyard of one of these slave forts, really slave castles on the African coast. We were filming on the coast of Ghana in one of these, and we were being asked on camera to talk about James DeWolf and his family and the evil that they had done. And we were doing exactly what you would expect, which is we were emphasizing just how horrible this history was that we were uncovering and how evil James DeWolf had been. And in the course of doing that, I realized that wasn't quite the history we'd been hearing. from historians in Rhode Island and in Africa as we've been taking this journey. As terrible as what the DeWolfs did was, what we were hearing again and again was how ordinary and commonplace this was. That slavery and the slave trade permeated virtually every aspect of life. And so ordinary citizens, white and non-white, were almost all involved in slavery and the slave trade. Ordinary Rhode Islanders 200 years ago in all walks of life had been connected to this history through providing goods to be sent on slaving voyages, helping build or provision those voyages, to dealing with the rum that was created here from molasses and sugar that were coming up from the West Indies, part of the triangle trade. Turns out even middle-class citizens, as soon as they had a little bit of money saved up in colonial times, would invest in small shares in slaving voyages because there was such a high return on those voyages. That was a large part of how they were financed. And so what I came to understand is James DeWolf wasn't considered particularly evil for what he did. He was considered a particularly good businessman. He was considered particularly good at the trade. But pretty much all of Rhode Island society was eager to participate in that trade along with him. People didn't see this as an evil business. And so understanding how ordinary people could be caught up in something that was in fact so evil, and understanding what that says about us today, where our society comes from, and what human nature really is for me a big part of this project.
And how about for you, Alon? When you read more and more about the history, how do you feel about it? Do you have a sort of visceral reaction?
I do sometimes. I've been a genealogist. I've been researching my family tree for almost 10 years, and so it can be difficult to not see myself or my parents or my siblings in the stories that I'm learning. It's just, as I'm doing the research, a lot of times I have to take a moment, step back, take a deep breath, and try and find a way to disconnect, because it is a really powerful and sometimes very upsetting history that we're learning.
And it's the foundation of our country, which is not what we hear when we go to school.
And yet very, very important for people to be learning. It really should be incorporated a lot better into the way that we teach history in America, because it's such a major component of American history.
Maybe it'll be part of legislation that starts to get some different education into the schools at some point. But when you read some of these slave stories, because they're slave narratives, even, what was it, 10 years a slave, 12 years a slave, that is so powerful to read. I read the book and as well as saw the movie. It is so powerful to read. And the constriction of one's life, the lack of any options at all, the lack of imagination because of the lack of physical options. It's astounding to think about, and to think now what is being achieved by people who are former slaves or have slavery in their background.
You know, there's so much to unpack in the history, and there are so many myths that we have. Even people who don't think they know much about the history of slavery at all are still very much caught up in these myths. So you look at 12 Years a Slave, it's no coincidence that that's the story of someone who is free and black in the North and is kidnapped into the South. There was plenty of slavery in the South, but there had also been plenty of slavery in the North, and for much longer and with much more consequence than we tend to remember. So something like 12 Years a Slave, as powerful as it is, also helps reinforce in the minds of many Americans, North and South, the myth that slavery had been primarily a Southern phenomenon.
He did know how to read. He didn't know how to write. He was actually very articulate and a profound writer, in my opinion. But anyway, as you move forward, you're going to find more of these stories. Is there some way that you can get some of these narratives into public hands so that some of the rest of us can read them? I think the archives, the Rhode Island archives, have some.
And there are a lot of stories that are definitely out there, available and easy to access for free. The Library of Congress has the slave narratives that were done by the Works Progress Administration back in, I think, the 1930s. Along with, there's the autobiography of, I think it's William J. Brown, who was enslaved to the Brown family. And that's a very, very interesting narrative to go through, talking about, I think, his father's enslavement to Moses Brown earlier on, before Moses became an abolitionist. So there are both local and national stories that we can definitely call on. And we're slowly pulling together a library in our office and a long list of resources that people can come to. Yes.
Okay. So your family, how is your family's history intertwined with all of this?
It's definitely intertwined. James and I were joking once about how some of my earliest known ancestors came from South Carolina before coming to and spending most of what I know of our history in Alabama and Georgia. And I believe one of the ships that the DeWolfs had owned was dropping off enslaved people in South Carolina. So, I mean, there's a huge connection going on there. And my family, like some African American families, had stories of slavery that were passed down to the modern members. Stories that we gather and we discuss during family reunions, over Christmas dinner. And it was really these stories that got me so interested in genealogy and really made me connect with American history in ways that I had not when I was originally going through school.
Can you tell us one of those stories?
Sure. My 3 times great-grandfather had an older sister who was born, a younger sister who was born in slavery, and she ended up becoming one of the first black teachers in Alabama. And so during slavery, when she was about 5 or 6 years old, she realized that her master's children were learning how to read and to write. And so she would play with them all the time, and then she started kind of tricking them to teach her how to write her own name. So she would ask them, write my name in the dirt. And then she would tell them, no, don't clear it away. I don't want to sweep it away. And so she would sweep around her name all day. And then at night, she would go back and trace over the letters. And so she was slowly teaching herself how to read and write by making other people help her without them really recognizing it. And so she passed those stories down to, even though she never had any children, she passed those stories down to the nieces and nephews who came and lived with her during segregation, because there were no local high schools for black students in that area. And so a lot of my cousins would go and live with her during middle and high school and be educated by her until they could move on to their next step in education.
One of the things that's so striking about how we deal with the history of slavery in this country is we haven't made a whole lot of room for stories like these to be told. We tend to talk about slavery from a white perspective, which makes it a bloodless history, if you will.
It's economic, maybe.
It's economic. Now, understanding the economic ramifications is also something we don't do well enough. We tend to talk as if slavery mostly had an impact on the economy of the South, and if it was mostly a backward agrarian style of economics that benefited a few wealthy plantation owners. It turns out slavery was absolutely essential to the free labor economy of the North and to our industrialization. But as you say, the moment we start talking about that, we have to remember that we need space for these stories, which we have generally not done. The way we tell our history also tends to minimize the agency of those who were enslaved or those who were free, what they were doing to resist slavery, how they were forging lives around slavery, and of course what they did after slavery ended.
It's an amazing story.
Exactly, and to be able to tell more of these is critical. At the same time, we don't want to forget that in some ways we need to tell more of the white stories connected to this as well. We've been very good about talking about white slave owners and what they did. We don't tend to talk about how most white families in this country were connected to slavery. So we mentioned that the Episcopal Diocese initiated the Center for Reconciliation. The Episcopal Diocese did that in part so that we as Episcopalians can tell the story of how the Episcopal Church was caught up in complicity in slavery.
So what is that?
So,
can you tell me that story?
So it's a whole lot of things. A lot of the money that started Episcopal churches in this country and that created wonderful buildings and stained glass windows and so forth was money that came from slavery or the slave trade. In Bristol, Rhode Island, St. Michael's Episcopal Church was heavily financed by the DeWolf family, and no one ever mentioned that that sort of opulence, if you will, came from the slave trade. The Episcopal Cathedral, St. John's in Providence, became a cathedral under my great-grandfather, who was James DeWolf Perry as well, and was the Episcopal Bishop of Rhode Island. His family connection and where a lot of the money was raised for buildings like that was rarely discussed. And so it's important to be able to talk about that. But it's other things. In Newport, Rhode Island, as the Quakers were shifting from having been very pro-slavery to being some of the earliest abolitionists, many Quakers were uncomfortable with their church's stance against slavery. And the Episcopal Church, among others, welcomed those Quakers with open arms if they wanted to come to a church that was much more open to continuing slavery. And so that's one illustration of how the Episcopal Church, among many others in this country, really helped to justify slavery, to promote it, to encourage people to think of slavery as something natural and not to object to it.
We're talking now about the Center for Reconciliation that's being built in Providence. The word reconciliation clearly has unbelievable numbers of levels of reality, because one has to reconcile oneself, and then one's family, and then one's city, and obviously one's church. All of these things are part of what you're talking about. But maybe you could unpack the word reconciliation for me a little bit.
Well, you've already given a good indication of how we want to approach the topic of reconciliation. It's something that occurs on many levels, has many facets to it. We also want to embrace the fact that when it comes to a topic like race in this country, we have people approaching the subject with very different perspectives on race, very different experiences of race, very different needs and desires. And so we want a broad understanding of reconciliation that can encompass people's different needs. It starts with the individual level. People need to educate themselves. People need to get to the place where they can acknowledge some of the truths about our history and the reality of race today that we have tended to deny, so that we can move forward together. And then we do need to embrace reconciliation as being fundamentally about interpersonal relationships. And so we want people to have a chance, when they are ready, which will be different for different people, to reach across racial lines, to forge new kinds of friendships, new kinds of communication. We find there's a phenomenon in this country where even people who have strong relationships of one kind or another across racial lines, often the subject of race itself does not get raised, or there are truths about race that are simply not discussed. And helping people get to the place where they can share their stories and be able to come much closer together by recognizing the realities they've been living with is very important. And then, of course, reconciliation has a lot to do with institutions coming together, whether it's churches, other communities of faith, civic institutions, and so forth, entire communities learning to come together in new ways. And finally, it's very important for us that for a lot of people, social justice is going to be an essential part of reconciliation. For many people, it's simply not possible to reconcile unless we tackle some of the realities in our society today and start to unpack and undo some of those.
And this seems to be the time, because we're looking at all these issues. We're being forced to look at these issues, partially because of violence, but also because of our political system, which has now highlighted our racial phobia. I don't know how you say racial phobia, but anyway, that's what we have, and we're so afraid that we'll do anything to keep it a distance from us.
Well, I think the fear is a really huge part of why it's been such a struggle to have this conversation. A lot of people like to think that when it's something that's very difficult, we can get this done in one day or in one conversation or one training program. And people have to understand that it's a process. It's going to be a continuing process. And doing our best to distance ourselves from that fear of having these conversations will help us as we keep moving forward. Because we have to be able to talk to each other. And if we can't talk to each other, well, there's no way we're going to be able to work together.
And some communities are being forced to, but others can stay apart, as it were. There's a book out now, and I mentioned it to you when we were preparing. Ta-Nehisi Coates has written a book called Between the World and Me, and it's a love letter to his son, but it's also an indictment of the way we have raised ourselves the way he was raised as a black person, and the fears that he feels, and the changes that might happen because he's written this book, or because other people are learning different models in their educational system of being more, what is it called? Anyway, working together with other people who are different from them. Anyway, I can't imagine that you wouldn't have him come to speak, and that you wouldn't have his son come to talk about how he's been changed by this book as well. It's won the National Book Award, but it's certainly worth reading, and it's definitely talking about self-reconciliation. He had to reconcile his own terrors of walking down the street and being afraid. I was in a class at the Episcopal Divinity School, and the professor said, I walked into Bonwitz Tellers, and I was told if I was looking for a job as the janitorial service, I needed to go down to a different level. And she was looking for clothes, and she was a professor. And suddenly that moment for me was my realization of what my privilege. I had absolutely no idea of my privilege until then. I certainly had some, but not enough. And that personal story really changed me.
I loved Ta-Nehisi Coates' book. I'm only a few years younger than him, and there were a lot of the stories that he was telling that I really connected with. And that's even though I didn't grow up in the inner city of Baltimore. I actually grew up about 30 minutes away from Baltimore in a suburb. But there was a lot that he was saying that really spoke to my experience and experiences of my friends and family. As much as we would love to have Ta-Nehisi Coates come and speak for us, he's incredibly popular and expensive. And not only that, there are the experiences of African Americans who were born and raised in Rhode Island that I think should also be lifted up.
Definitely.
And spoken to. And so that's one of the reasons why our programs that we've been doing lately, going around the state, having conversations about race, it gives local people the opportunity to talk about their own personal experiences, what happened to them going into this store, in this place, and those different interactions. And so maybe it's not a nice long book with lots of details and beautifully written, but sometimes the local stories, having someone look you in the eye while they're speaking from their own personal experience, can be just as powerful, if not more.
The next show we're going to tape is about Slater Mill, and Slater Mill could not have existed, and all of the economic growth and social growth that occurred because of that mill is because of the cotton trade. And so it is based in slavery, and none of us ever realized that the Industrial Revolution was, in the North, was based on slavery in the South.
It's one of these convenient fictions, and the way in which slavery played out historically allowed us to do this, to talk as if the North had free labor and moved towards industrialization, and as if the South had a very different economic system built on enslaved labor and a fundamentally agrarian society. In fact, this was one economy, North and South, that simply played different roles. And the South develops cotton as its primary export in the 1800s, and it's exporting in large part to the North, which is specializing in financing and insuring and shipping all of this cotton. And as you say, to industrializing with that cotton. Without cheap slave-produced cotton, the United States and the North doesn't industrialize. And if we don't industrialize, that changes the entire course of our history.
It's amazing. It's amazing. Obviously, we could talk for hours. Thank you so much for being here, James DeWolf Perry and Elon Cook. I certainly wish you the best in your Center for Reconciliation. We're all looking forward to hearing more about this and finding more about ourselves, making us more human. Thank you. Thank you for watching Good News Rhode Island. I'm sure that there is good news in your community. Maybe it's stories just as we've been talking about right now that you need to tell each other. Thank you for watching.